Chapter 9. For Richer, for Poorer. At long last, it was the 27th of December 1986, and we were getting married. Over the past year, while I had devoted every waking hour to bringing peace to North Belfast, Lesley and her mother had managed to find enough time on top of their busy jobs to organise what they hoped would be the wedding of the year. I had received constant updates on progress on everything from flowers to venues to cars. The level of forward planning and military precision rivalled that of the ever-present British Army in the new lodge, but without the risk of anyone being shot in the back. I was aware that a few dramas had been averted en route to the big day, and by Christmas Eve everything was prepared for the perfect wedding, Ulster Presbyterian style. Apart from turning up, my only task was to organise the honeymoon. I had also been given instructions to practice driving to the country house hotel in Kells on Boxing Day to ensure I would not get lost on any rural roads on the day. My limited driving and navigational skills apparently carried a high risk factor for ruining the whole day. My worst performance to date had been to take the road to Portrush on the north coast as the route to Lurgan in the south of Ulster. Thankfully, disproving all my driving doubters, on the day itself I managed the journey admirably. Accompanied by my older brother, my best man, and an old school friend, Jim, my groomsman, we arrived at the hotel in good time to check into the wedding suite, change into our good hair suits from Parsons and Parsons, and get into the 1940s wedding car that awaited for us to take us on the journey to Macaulay. As the chauffeur with an indecipherable County Antrim accent transported us through a sea of unfamiliar frosty fields, I was aware that my life was about to change forever. Once the initial chat and excitement died down, I gazed out the window on that crisp December morning, and in the silence I experienced an unfamiliar feeling of being single and alone. This confirmed to me that I was ready for married life. More importantly, sex sanctioned by God was long overdue. Strangers waved at our car and tooted their horns as we passed, as if we were celebrities, and there was already a small crowd assembled around the gates of Belfast Presbyterian Church when we arrived there 30 minutes later. Getting married was like becoming a star. Lesley and I would be like Kylie Minogue and Jason Donovan for the day. Belfast is a small village in County Londonderry, near Macrofelt, which at that time had around 1,000 inhabitants, of which more than 800 were Catholics. In many ways, Belfast was like a mini New Lodge, but up the country and with more paramilitaries and more Protestants. From this tiny population had come the great poet Seamus Heaney, two famous hunger strikers, Francis Hughes and Thomas Macaulay, Dominic McGlinchey, the best known member of the INLA, Margaret Johnson, world champion bowler, and Lesley Evans. Mention of Lesley's native village regularly impressed the lads at the Salt Shaker. Certainly most of the residents were Republicans, but unlike in Belfast, they often lived next door to their Protestant neighbours. For some reason they didn't build walls between Protestants and Catholics in Belfast, but everyone knew where the Protestants' field stopped and the Catholics' field started, and you daren't sell your land to the other side. I was fascinated to discover how many young people in the new lodge claimed that Dominic McGlinchey was their uncle. This heroic uncle seemed to have scores of nephews of a wide variety of ages. However, the young people soon learned to temper their boasts of McGlinchey kinship when Lesley was present, because she was able to verify their accuracy. My own credibility leapt considerably when I revealed on the last Tuesday night youth club before the wedding that we had received 3 lovely wedding presents from various members of the McGlinchey family. For some of the youth club members, this was the equivalent of telling my late granny that I'd got a wedding present from the royal family or the Reverend Ian Paisley. I knew no Protestant with less hatred for Republicans than Lesley. She abhorred their violence as much as I did, and had argued with her neighbours about the rights and wrongs of using violence for political ends. But she understood their point of view and regarded them as human beings she had grown up with, rather than evil monsters from the other side you only heard about on TV. Lesley had grown up as an only child next door to 11 McGlinchey siblings. As a little girl, her first best friend was Siobhan McGlinchey, and as they played with their dolls together, in and out of each other's houses and gardens, Lesley was like the 12th McGlinchey. In fact, there were both Protestants and Catholics standing around the church gates to catch a glimpse of the bride, although on this particular occasion, Catholics were in the minority. There was more to Belfast than labels and sectarian stereotypes, but that was true of most places in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. At the church gates, I waved at a few old school friends from Belfast who had popped up the country for my wedding day and who would be joining us later at the evening reception. I was very relieved when I got inside the church to see that all my relatives had made it to South Derry, some of them in a specially hired minibus. Belfast was only a 30-minute drive from the city, but up the country always seems very far away for Belfast people. The road from Belfast up the country is always longer than the same road home. The Reverend Kinahan arrived wearing a pure white clerical vestment embroidered with golden sacred symbols from his time in Africa. The look of surprise on some of the faces at the church gate suggested that the people of Belfast thought the Pope had arrived. Some were pleasantly surprised and some were appalled. Belfast Presbyterian was between ministers at the time, so my minister, the Reverend David Temple from Ballygomartin Presbyterian, who had been supporting my mother through her grief, conducted the wedding ceremony, while the Reverend Kinahan said the prayers. A concerned whispered at the back of the church that "Your man's going to do a Hail Mary, so he is," was unfounded. The music was led by two of my favourite women in the world. The organist was Ruth Hutchinson, my former P5 teacher, who had been my friend and an exceptional encourager ever since I was 8 years old. And the soloist was my mother's dear sister, my Auntie Dot, who was a talented singer and a warm heart and sense of humour in our family circle. I kept looking around to check if my mother was okay, because she was clearly up to 100. I sat at the front beside my best man and groomsman, as my younger brother and Lesley's cousin's son William ushered in the guests. I fidgeted, checked I had the ring, turned around to smile and wave at friends, and sweated and fidgeted more, and in my nervous state it even crossed my mind to wonder what I would do if Lesley didn't show up, like in all the best soap operas. Ruth kept looking over her reading glasses towards the back door, until, to my great relief, she started to play the trumpet voluntary, and then the processional hymn, Love Divine, All Loves Excelling. I turned around, and there she was, my Lesley, in a wedding dress and veil, looking beautiful, sparkling and smiling her perfect smile. I unexpectedly felt very emotional, and as the congregation stood to sing, I had to choke back the tears. The bridesmaids followed behind as Lesley's tall father led her elegantly up the aisle. When she arrived beside me, I told her she was beautiful and held her hand, which was shaking a little, in my hand, which was sweating a lot. When the music stopped, the congregation sat down, and after a moment of dramatic silence, the wedding ceremony began. My mother was audibly distraught for most of the service, and some of the congregation also became distraught at her distress. At most weddings, the mother of the groom shed a little tear as she let go of her son. But at my wedding, my grief-stricken mother sobbed for the loss of her husband, who could and should have been sitting beside her and holding her shaking hand. I was upset, but I was determined that my father's absence was not going to dampen my big day. Within a few minutes, we had completed our I wills and I do's, no to obeys, and we headed into the minister's room to sign the register and make it official. At this point, Auntie Dot sang an uplifting version of Down from His Glory to the tune of O Solo Mio. When we returned hand in hand to the front of the church, as Dot sang her heart out in the final verse, my best man nudged me from behind and asked if I wanted just one cornetto. When we processed out of the church, it seemed as if half the village was waiting to throw confetti at us. As a native of Belfast, it was a new experience to be in a public place and to have strangers throwing material at me that wasn't intended to cause injury. We began our journey to the Country House Hotel in Kells in our classic car. This was not the same village of Kells as in the world-famous multicoloured Book of Kells, although as a village, the county antrim Kells did contain a remarkable number of purple Presbyterian hymn books. This was our first private moment since being declared man and wife, and we chattered like breathless and excited children the whole way to the wedding reception. Lesley kept asking me if I liked her dress and if her hair was okay, and I told her she was perfect. Now it was just the two of us, together, forever. Arriving at the hotel, we thanked God that it wasn't raining, as usual, or snowing, as we prepared for the all-important wedding photographs. My new wife encouraged me to relax and smile, and not to stand like a model in a club book. Lesley's mother later sent the best photographs to the Ulster Tatler magazine, and they were published, although the editor did have to request that at least one should include the groom. Ultimately, the dress, the flowers and the photography were independently judged a great success when Lesley was awarded runner-up in a Bride of the Year competition. As the guests arrived for the reception and the congratulations and kisses and hugs continued, my face ached from smiling so much for the first and last time in my life. Empirical evidence that this was indeed the happiest of days. The speeches passed off with some sadness due to my father's absence, some nervousness on my father-in-law's part, a reminder to all present by the Reverend Taylor that they needed to be saved, and numerous embarrassing references to my poor driving skills. Lesley and I were determined that our evening reception would not be a traditional Ulster wedding disco at which elderly relatives danced with small children to the Rivers of Babylon or Blanket on the Ground, performed by a cabaret band from Ballymena. Early in the year, we had spotted a group of young saxophonists busking in Belfast city centre. Buskers were cutting edge in Belfast in the 1980s. Anyone playing musical instruments outside BHS or Marks and Spencer was at risk of being blown up by a £1,000 car bomb planted by the IRA. For years, the only common street music in Belfast city centre had been a flute band or the music from Mickey Marley's Roundabout. While other shoppers passed by and threw coins into their woolly student hats, Lesley approached Saxophone Madness and asked them to play at our wedding reception. Most of our generation had their first dance to Chris de Burgh's Lady in Red, but our first dance was to Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade. The only problem was that 2 hours of Glenn Miller wasn't as effective as Dancing Queen at getting people of all ages up onto the dance floor. However, it was a happy evening with friends and family, apart from when I persuaded my mother up for a dance. She was very happy for me, but as I held her, I could feel her sadness. A sea of sympathetic faces surrounded us as we waltzed around the dance floor, reminding everyone of how beautifully my mother and father had danced together. We tried to speak to everyone to thank them for coming and for the lovely presents. Eventually, as Saxophone Madness repeated In the Mood for the third time, Lesley and I left in the Renault 5, which had tin cans tied to the back bumper and confetti scattered all over the blue bonnet. We returned to the back entrance of the hotel 5 minutes later and secretly crept through the kitchens to spend our first night in the honeymoon suite. After 23 years of waiting, I was definitely in the mood. The next day we made our way to the airport and flew from Belfast to Heathrow and then on to Casablanca, where we got stuck in fog and nobody played it again for Sam. As we waited in the airport, a tall Englishman in our travel group took the lead in representing the concerns of the delayed British tourists. "I recognise him," said Lesley. "Is he from Balaki? Does he know Mummy?" I looked closely at this distinguished-looking gentleman until finally the penny dropped. "It's your man that does that new Oprah show on BBC One in the mornings," I exclaimed. "Oh, my nerves," cried Lesley in a barely controlled whisper. "It's Robert Kilroy Silk." Eventually, we boarded our flight to Marrakesh. Robert Kilroy Silk's commanding presence proved useful when we finally arrived late at night, and he took charge of the drop-off of exhausted tourists from our package holiday coach to the assigned hotels. I wasn't sure which fact was the hardest to take in. That we were married, that sex was now permitted, that we were in North Africa, that there were camels outside, or that I was on honeymoon with Robert Kilroy Silk. When we finally arrived at our hotel in the middle of the night, I was disappointed to find that our room contained twin beds instead of a double. I attempted complaining to reception that this was an inappropriate bed layout for a newly married couple, but with limited shared language skills, it was difficult to get to the bottom of such a complex cultural issue with the Moroccan gentleman on reception. We had to settle for pushing the twin beds together. This was unfortunate, as we had enough to figure out without the added hazard of falling down between the two beds. After waiting so long for sex, I felt the very least we deserved was the space in which to try to do it properly. However, by the end of the week, we had attempted every possible angle and had eventually worked out how everything fitted together. As the days went by in Marrakesh, I swaggered a little every time I remembered the night before and the fact that I was now a fully experienced man of the world. For 10 days we were in paradise and a world away from peace walls and petrol bombs. This was my longest consecutive series of days in more than a year in which I hadn't been called a specky bastard. Of course, I felt guilty about who was opening and locking up a youth club while I was watching snake charmers and belly dancers. I felt guilty about how my mother was surviving her first New Year's Eve and New Year's Day as a widow, while I was enjoying a North African New Year's feast that cost £100 a head, more than the cost of 40 variety meals from Kentucky Fried Chicken, and watching even more delightful belly dancers, albeit furtively so as not to upset my new wife. A few minutes after midnight, Lesley and I walked hand in hand into the garden of our hotel in Marrakesh. We stood in silence beside the pool, surrounded by palm trees, and gazed up at the magnificent and clear Arabian sky. Then we kissed and embraced. It was perfect. They're looking up at that same sky and those same stars back in Belfast, I said romantically. Let's forget about Belfast tonight, said Lesley. After 10 days of souks, sand and sex, and several offers of a camel in return for my new wife, we headed home. Back at the airport, we picked up our car and we drove back to Belfast for our first night together on the Peace Line. It was cold and frosty on the broken pavements at Bruceville Park, and all was quiet. We caught red-handed two of Leslie's student flatmates, both called Heather, both from Portadown, putting rice in our bed and cling film on the toilet as a cheeky welcome home. After hugs all round, they scurried off chuckling, and I carried Lesley over the threshold into our house.